And welcome to the Industry 4 Community Podcast. I am your host with the most, Walker D. Reynolds. We have a very special conversation today on FOSS, free and open source software in industry. Specifically, we'll be talking about the Ming stack, Mosquito, InfluxDB, Node-RED, and Grafana, or Chronograph, whatever it is you'd like to use. This conversation has been is an extension of a much larger conversation that happened in the Industry 4 Discord server and was extended from some LinkedIn posts that Enri Marini did maybe a month ago now, 4 weeks ago. I have Mark O'Donovan, Enri Marini, and obviously Zach is here with me, all members of the Industry 4 community. I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves real quick, and then we're going to start on this open source conversation. And actually what I'll do is we'll have Mark introduce himself. Enri, go ahead and introduce yourself after, and then why don't you give us the definition of FOSS for industry? Mark, to you.
So, Mark O'Donovan, I'm sitting in Ireland. I'm a system architect, probably 20 years experience in engineering, 15 plus PLC programming, SCADA. I worked my way up the old stack. PLC, SCADA, into MES, bit of databases, bit of interface with ERP. The last few years, I've sort of moved on to helping people as they start their journey not make all the mistakes I made building monolith digital transformation solutions. So that's me.
And you are, for the sake of this conversation, you are a FOSS advocate in industry?
Not necessarily. I don't have
not
a problem
necessarily
using it.
Okay.
I love the Ming stack, but I suppose my position would be we have to choose the best solution, whether it is open source or not.
Got it. Enri.
Hey, thanks for the shout out. My name's Enri. I frankly wear too many hats to remember all of them. I've been in manufacturing my entire career, and for the definition I take on open source is essentially being able to modify, install, and overall see all artifacts involved with the project and not have any sort of restrictions on who gets to say how you wish to implement any individual artifact or collectively the artifacts. As far as my stance, even I actually do not entirely endorse exclusively FOSS within industrial automation. Particularly, I argue for open source as a movement and philosophy, and in particular, chances I have been able to use individual open source products and projects. Obviously, I would lean towards using those. I think fundamentally there's many facets that I think we'll get into our conversation here surrounding open source. So that's overall my stance.
Here some important, so for those of you who are not familiar with open source, or what's the difference between open source and open architecture, right? These are important distinctions.
Sure.
Open source is we have visibility into the source code, whether it's a compiled language or a non-compiled language. We have access to the source code that we can manipulate ourselves and add features. A really good example would be everybody in this community is using MQTT Explorer. MQTT Explorer is an open source solution that was developed by a guy named Thomas Nordquist. He has since stopped supporting it. If you go to the GitHub for MQTT Explorer, you can make your own branch. You can access all the source code, and you could add features, which we've done. We've added in a Sparkplug B parser, that kind of stuff. You can do those things with open source. You can't do that with a closed source platform. Open architecture is software that could be closed source or open sourced, but what it is designed is to talk to all things within an architecture. So that is, I have access to various types of data sources. I have access to underlying data models. So the ORM that models, say, a visualization in a closed sourced application, if it were open architecture, I could actually query that ORM to see how that thing is built. Like, for example, in Ignition, in Ignition, which is closed source but open architecture, you can query the ORM, which is the internal database inside of Ignition, to see how the tags are actually built in the back end. So I may look at a tag in a tree structure, and that's how I see it. But what's put in that tree actually comes from a back end inside of Ignition, and Ignition gives you the ability to view that. That is open architecture. So those are the differences between open source and open architecture.
There's a lot of conflation there, because that was one of the main components that Enri mentioned that he likes about open source, was that he could see all of the underlying components of the software. He didn't actually, I believe free is not necessarily one of the main things that you're advocating for, but does open source necessarily dictate that it is free?
Enri, that's a good question for Enri or Mark.
Yeah, the product necessarily itself, I believe, does not necessarily have to be free without a cost associated in some way. I think that often gets conflated. There are many nuances with the licensing model. Predominantly, though, what you will find in the vast majority of open source projects is the ability to outright implement and launch, just as you would your local Word doc application, is free. And the ability then to modify can be free given certain parameters.
Correct.
And there are various considerations thereafter. Say you wish to build a solution for some customer that you utilize an open source project with. There may or may not be fees associated with your ability to sell and how you can in fact sell. But predominantly what I support is the ability to outright see essentially what's underneath the hood, to have the ultimate authority on how you wish to implement, configure, or potentially even build upon such modules, and nobody else having the authority to tell you that you otherwise could not. Now, of course, again, how you then utilize it will have some sort of fees associated. And again, if you wish to sell that solution to somebody else, there are fees associated there. So it's not just this umbrella of purely free. And there's also, of course, the labor hours involved in making all that happen.
Why do we have closed source and open source?
If you want to hear my take on it, honestly, I think there's, I'll go tinfoil hat. I think predominantly it is a move to control a sphere that frankly cannot be controlled. When you talk about software development, anything you have in your mind, if you are willing to put in the effort, you truly can make it. And I think that scares a lot of special interest groups. And just to have freedom is something that not everybody takes lightly to. There will always be some sort of force trying to exert their will onto you to limit that freedom.
This is why the data is the more valuable part, not the software. But
Mark,
when you're seeing under the hood, do you mean specifically the source code or like the ORM, Enri?
Both and beyond.
Mark, your take on why we have closed source and open source.
And I think maybe coming from a more compliant background, society, yeah, most people don't really care what's under the hood. Even take a car, most people who drive cars don't know how an engine works. So going in and looking in, so most people want a solution that works for what they want to do. They don't care, is it open or closed source, because they're not going to look at the source code. So they get more concerned about performance. Then you have to look at, well, when software was first being developed, it was developed by users. It was essentially open source. If we go back to, punch cards and the NASA hidden figures type stuff, it was developed for people to use it. Then someone I would guess, got contracted in to do it. So it was bespoke solutions of code. And then it got into a place where someone said, well, I'm doing this. I want to make money, so I'll sell it. And we got closed source the same way, Coca-Cola, Pepsi don't give away their formula. The formula is known, I'm sure. But, they need to protect it. So I don't think, it's as much this someone's trying to control it. It's hugely, there might be some of that. I'm not saying that is not there. A lot of users don't care.
Right, so here's my take on closed source, open source. I think most people who write software who close the source out, they close it for two reasons. Number one of them is a cynical reason. The other one is a more practical reason. If I invest thousands of hours, like I built a vision system with a machine learning algorithm a couple of years ago, right? And I spent 8 months writing that software. I wasn't an ML guy. I labored through it. I put my labor, 8 months of labor into that. And if I wasn't as savvy as I am about open source, like understanding that the code itself is not the most valuable thing, right? The lines of code is not the most valuable thing in software. If I was less savvy, I would have been much more likely to, obfuscate the code and wrap it and close it so that no one else could see the source code. All they got was the function. Okay. However, I didn't do that. I didn't do that because what I knew was that the lines I wrote aren't the important part. Like the function itself and what we can do with that function is the real value, the data that we can collect off of it. What I really care about are the events. And what I want to do is write software that everybody uses where I can collect the events centrally, and that data is something I could sell. Okay,
This reminds.
I was on site today.
Yeah.
With somebody, Siemens PLC program, password protected blocks.
Right.
Duty standby, timer. So some people don't.
There's nothing savvy about that.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's intellectual property about a timer.
They just don't want someone using their work. I mean, and I think that's at a crazy level.
So here's the cynical reason. The cynical reason is one part what Enri said, because I don't disagree with Enri. There's a reason that we have a open source unpaid community out there that's doing nothing but testing for vulnerabilities in software, or they're testing for how software is collecting data from you. Okay. Google, Apple, Microsoft, they have all been exposed by open source advocates and proselytizer who have tested their software and have revealed things that they were collecting about you that you didn't know. Okay. So that's the cynical part. It's like we want to close it so that people don't know exactly, the little hidden snippets of code in there that are doing things that you probably wouldn't agree with. That's cynical part number one. Here's the bigger one. I think a lot of people close their source because they realize when it's all said and done, it wasn't that hard to write what they wrote. And they don't want someone to just copy and paste it. They realize when they're all done, you know what? This wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it was. And if I just give it to the world, someone's going to make it way better and make me look stupid. And I believe that. I firmly believe that that's a huge.
Why is someone afraid of that?
Okay, well, okay. Rather
than putting the benefit of society first, like
call me. So
it's ego. It's ego. That's just pure ego.
If you go to, here's a good example. Remember on my LinkedIn a month ago or whatever, I copied a video. I linked a video that Rob Tiffany and some other guys who used to work with Microsoft, they worked on the Azure project, Azure IoT project. And they, by the way, one of the most enlightening conversations you will ever watch. You must go to my LinkedIn page, scroll down and find that clip. We'll actually link the video in the description of this podcast. You have 4 guys who all worked on Azure IoT, 2016, 17, 18, or whatever, openly admitting that what they built was garbage. It was just junk that they pieced together. They knew it was garbage. Their customers eventually found out it was garbage, But Microsoft wasn't telling the world it was garbage. The salespeople were all telling everyone that it was transformational. Now imagine Microsoft open sourced everything they did in Azure IoT. Would we have had to wait until 2024 to find that out from people who helped build it? Or would we have found that out in 2018? And the answer is we would have found out in 2018.
And those guys needed their jobs at that time.
Correct.
Enough to not say, hey, this is bullshit.
And I mean, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that's not a reason that vendors, OEMs close their source.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to funding, it's, I think, a great segue into yet another aspect of this whole topic, which is how is it these projects can or potentially should be funded. And I think the answer ultimately lies that there is no one source of funding. Again, I lean on that the project absolutely must always be removed from the financier, predominantly in industrial automation.
Agree.
I can tolerate some people who might be fanboys in certain other sectors. Essentially, though, industrial automation, we're dealing with people's lives. Like, a lot of stuff can go bad really, really quickly. And I see...
And livelihood. Lives
yes,
and livelihood.
Yep. Absolutely. And I see zero reason to go down the path of, well, it has to be open source. That is more feed to, yes, this must be, all this critical infrastructure must be open source for that very reason of security. How many times do we hear that as a reason to restrict? And how many times have we seen scientific evidence that when you open source something, you can harden it way faster, you can find far more issues, and you can iterate on those issues to improve.
Mark?
But, so, I mean, that's an argument about should vendors be open source. Will vendors being open source give us better solutions than if vendors are closed source? And I suppose I'm coming at it from a different point of view, because I'm looking at it going, I have to get the best product from my customer who wants to do manufacturing. You know, today, he's, you know, what's the best solution? And I have a duty to give them the best solution, you know, and I take the same view because there are jobs and livelihoods at stake. We talk about Excel. If I'm going to use a spreadsheet today, and I've used spreadsheets back to Supercalc, and if you Google it, it's blue screen with yellow text and everything's commands. Excel is still the best spreadsheet software out there. I've tried everything else. I've tried Open Sheets, Open Docs, Apache Docs. Tried them all. Excel is so good it gets used for all the things it shouldn't.
What is the and what here? This is a very fair point. I've tried OpenDoc. I've tried lots of. The reality is that the open source software typically lags far behind the commercial software in terms of feature set.
Because there wasn't a financial incentive to invest in the development.
Well, what I would say...
No, because it was free labor, and you're expecting people... This is the whole thing that I try to educate people on. You know, I was watching a video recently, and these folks were making an application marketplace for a Linux distribution. It's a team of like 5 people on their video. It frankly breaks my heart to see when these conversations go south and they're complaining about not utilizing the proper project management tool. And you come to find out these guys are actually working 2 full-time jobs. And we somehow have the freaking audacity to expect top-notch quality work without a single cent being paid to them. And furthermore, we have the audacity to make remarks that, oh, these products are not aligning in certain feature sets to their commercial counterparts. Well, yeah, it's because these guys are getting paid 6-figure salaries to build to those, and they have entire freaking armies. Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, Azure IoT laid off 10,000 people. I mean, they laid off 10,000 people. There's no open source project that I've ever come across that has 10,000 people on the team. Even a large open source project is going to have 300. That'll be huge, right? If you have 300 active developers on an open source project. The answer to your question, Zach, is it's limited resources. In the open source community, you have fewer developers. You have, in absolute numbers, more developers. But in per capita numbers by solution, you have fewer developers. There are more absolute open source developers than there are people who are commercial developers.
How many
most developers have a day job?
Go ahead, Mark.
I was saying, how many developer hours do they have? Because a lot of those open source developers are working the day job for a closed source solution.
But look at the best open source solutions. Okay, so let's talk about the open source, the hybrid solution, like Portainer, for example.
Yeah.
So Portainer is a Docker management platform that we use. I'm going to actually talk about how we use open source with commercial software here in a little bit. Okay, but Portainer is an open source solution that has a free community edition that you can download and use, and it's probably 80% of the functionality in Portainer. Okay, totally open source, totally free. It's incredible. It's incredible. But it is an open source platform built by a commercial company. I mean, Neil Cresswell, who's the CEO of Portainer, he has resources all over the world who are building Portainer, and they're getting paid to do it. And the reason why is because on top of that open source solution is a commercial offering. So it once you get to a certain threshold, I want to go into production. I want to use a distributed architecture. I want some feature sets that are unique to just the commercial offering. Now I'm paying. And then they're funding the development of the open source solution. We need more of that. Right?
100%.
And I believe Enri is advocating that in fact, that's what Enri's been advocating for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. People apparently take issue with that. And that's why I'm here to have this conversation. I think it surprises me how many people do, in fact, take issue with that very statement. Issue? That you're expecting, number one, the same quality of work without any sort of funding for the project. And for not only that, but for the project to actually continue to be successful and be iterated upon without any sort of financial arm behind the scenes.
This is kind of what we do at 4.0 Solutions and IIoT University. We put a lot of effort into our free and community content and managing the Discord server. And, we all get paid a salary to do that on the team at 4.0. And then, it's kind of like a land and expand model where once people get into the mastermind and our paid training offerings, enterprise training, that kind of thing, our STEP training program, certification for engineers, then that's how we actually pay our bills.
Here's the actual metrics, and I think this would apply to open source software. We have 1 million unique viewers of our free YouTube content. We have 100,000 subscribers across platforms. We have 13,000 students at IIoT.University. And of the 13,000 students, 800 of them they're financially supporting everything we do. So you've got 800 people out of 1 million who are financially supporting everything we do in this podcast. This
and
studio.
We get comments saying, "Why can't you do more technical training on our YouTube channel?"
you have 800 people who support the education of 1 million, or at a minimum 13,000. And if we extended that to the open source, I'll guarantee Neil Cresswell from Portainer is going to tell us that he's got 10 million downloads of Portainer and he's got 100,000 paid licenses.
And those people who are paying are going to get the features they want.
Oh, absolutely.
Regardless of the people who are downloading and not using, but I suppose the bit that I took most issue with was, isn't about freedom. It's the claim, and it's not just Enri. You're not. I don't think you're an outlier making this claim, which I've seen before, that OT people are scared of open source or are running away from open source. I mean, my last project proof of concept built on a Mink stack on Portainer. You look at the amount of people using Node-RED. You look at the amount of people, and these are OT people using it. I think there are technical limitations with what are available at level 1 and level 2, PLCs, SCADA, field devices. But so we're kind of talking about this layer 3 MES IoT functionality, and that's another bit that gets me annoyed when people talk about OT and they mean the bit that's close to IT. We don't care about the PLC and all that stuff down there. And
the events in the PLC are the most important events in your entire business. It's like,
Yeah, I would argue that advocacy comes in all shapes and forms, and I argue throughout the entire stack for open source. And so, one of the things that I do not see much of in the way of being such a hard-headed advocate for open source is really taking this to not only OEMs but other funding bodies potentially, and that's what I aim to do. And so, if other people choose to join in, so be it. I definitely would recommend. I think we are living in the best age for independent investigative journalism, and you will find very quickly the ties between product to individuals and the relationships those individuals have to that enable them to make it a commercial success. And the little tidbit I use as a audio snippet here is when it comes to closed source solutions, their success relies entirely on shareholder greed and success, and does not apply to open source success. It entirely exclusively relies on stakeholder success and being able to actually solve their need and meet their requirements.
And I, because we're going to pivot here in a second. I'm going to ask you guys. We're gonna list solutions at each layer of the stack that are open source. Okay, because people are going to be like, okay, what is open source at each layer of the stack? Okay, so, but I agree with Enri here. You want to know what the biggest problem is and why we don't see wider adoption of open source and industrial software? It's venture capital. Okay, if you look at a VC group that invests in industrial platforms, and I see this because I speak to, there's a lot of OEMs that reach out to me and they want me to look at their stuff and they want me to go pitch to their investors. They'll ask me pitch to their investors, and they're always venture capital folks. You know what the VC cares about? They don't care about the outcome for the customer. They never even ask any questions about the outcome for the customer. Ever.
That's why they don't want land and expand.
Right. The investor never asks me any questions about how the client, the end user, benefits from this software. What they care about is total addressable market and what percentage of the market they think they will get if they build this solution. And then they insist on immediate return, like right away. So get a list of 100 people, close 10% of them, 10% of them at X number of dollars. It's the investor is driving the decision makings of the developer. And let me say this. There's a platform, they're one of the platforms that I talk to their investors. I've been with them since the very beginning. I've advised them on how to build their platform and what features need to be there. Even their own executives will tell me privately that the pressure they get from their investors to immediately sell the like, don't focus on land and expand. Don't focus on getting this software in as many people's hands as possible so that they can give you feedback on how to make it better. Okay? Focus on sales. And that's all the investors are focused on. So I agree with Enri. The biggest challenge is the way that these solutions are being funded.
I got a question.
Go ahead.
It's a hypothetical thought experiment. So let's say all developers that currently, have their day job that's paying their bills, they're developing closed source solutions, maybe even for some of these venture capital firms. Let's just say all developers are released into the market to develop open source solutions, and all enterprises start working with these open source solutions. Do humans have the ability to, pay for these, either through donations or paying for the paid features, or because in order for there to actually be an economy built upon this such that developers could sustain their own livelihoods developing these open source solutions?
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one to answer. Let me ask it to you this way, Zach. What can $3 billion do for you? And I say that in a non-joking fashion because when we take a look at the New York State government agencies regarding the supporting of the manufacturing industry,
yep,
that's exactly, we're talking about over $3 billion exclusively that was provisioned to achieve just this very dream, and it's miserably failed. So again, what can $3 billion do for you?
And why did it fail? We'll talk about New York State real quick. New York State had two primary initiatives. One was like these block grants for innovation that Enri's referring to. And then there's also this concept called the Empire Zone, where basically they could say areas of the state were empire zone areas, which means that if you were to put a manufacturer there, you would get 10 years tax abatement. So you wouldn't pay any taxes for 10 years. They would give you money to help you build your facility. They would do all the road infrastructure and parking lots and all that kind of stuff, right? So the state did two things. They had these block grants that Enri is referring to here, which was basically money that was supposed to go toward innovation. People would apply for the money for innovation. And we saw a lot of this in central New York related to Cornell University. A lot of it came out of universities. And then you had these empire zones. And I think Enri's being kind when he says that it failed miserably. I would say that it was an abject shit show. It was rife with corruption. Dollars just went to people who had no business, had no ability to innovate. The decision to distribute those dollars wasn't a function of whether or not they were actually going to innovate. It was a function of relationship. All right, my
take on this, to answer my own question, is I suspect that it's not. I do suspect there is a certain subset of the population, and we see it ourselves, where it's like, some of our students in Mastermind, they're like, hey, look, I've gotten so much free value out of your free content. I feel like I owed you, and I wanted to support what you were doing so we could help do more of it.
That's a personality type. There's
not enough people that would actually. There's the other people though that would want every single thing for free and extract as much value out of it as they can while paying as little as possible.
One of the things that Enri said in one of his posts was he talked about you have a obligation to pay once you've gotten value.
I think I agree, because otherwise the economy does not work.
I agree 100%. But Mark, you agree? Obligation.
100%. I mean, I told you the story about the shoe shop. I go to a shoe shop that's more expensive for running shoes because he gives me proper shoes, and I want him to be there the next time I go to get my shoes. I can buy them cheaper online. I've had this conversation. People talk about, unpaid interns aren't quite so much a big thing, but if someone's coming in, and I don't have any company now, someone's coming in and they're doing that work that gives me value, even if it's getting my coffee so I don't have to, well, there's a value there, and there's a value transaction and a duty to pay. 100% agree on that. But think
there's a lot of people who don't share that belief. You agree?
Yeah. There's I think this stigma for this being a sort of white collar profession as well, that the topics around politics and the forces that sway these technical matters is beyond approach, essentially beneath us. Let somebody else who specializes, so to say, in these political matters address this. And what I say to that is, while we can rely to a small extent on watchdog groups who take a look at the finances for firms, I think where folks like us fit into the equation is we can really provide that technical intimacy to really go the distance and explain these other factors on why some of this corruption not only might have been taking place, but just how they were able to pull it off, and explain the ramifications of such. And to just finish on that last point, we don't have to look too far from New York State's failings on this. It is a very common practice, especially in the VC world. You can take a look at LA and California.
Right.
Oftentimes, what happens is nonprofits are essentially created as shell companies to distribute money from vendors, as you might like to call them, OEMs, for various services. And essentially what you will find very quickly is 2 layers down, the same individual who is sitting as a board member is also the owner of the company receiving said funds. And you really don't have to look too far. It's publicly accessible. And I think because this is so rampant, people have been accepting it as normal, but it is far from that.
So let's pivot real quick. I want to talk about open source in industry, and we're going to go through the stack. So we'll do the 5-layer instead of the 6-layer. So PLC and HMI will be together. Okay. I'm going to start with one of the big questions I get is, hey, Walker, what is the most common stack that you guys put in place? Okay. So the most common stack is at on the edge, you are dealing with, and we're going to go native open architecture for Industry 4. So that's going to be something like Opto 22 Groove Epics on the edge. It's going to be PLC Next on the edge. Okay. It's going to be open architecture PLCs doing your automation. Your HMI is going to be something like Factory Studio or Frameworks from Tatsoft, which is open architecture but closed source. And that's going to be like your HMI layer, or maybe Ignition Edge, or enter in some other open architecture solution. WinCCOA is another one. At the SCADA layer, it's going to be WinCCOA, it's going to be Frameworks, it's going to be Ignition. Ignition is by far, I would say, an 80 to 90% open architecture applications. Ignition is what you've got at both the SCADA and MES layer, okay? At the MES layer, let's just go ahead and say it's Ignition. You've built MES inside of Ignition, open architecture. ERP, this is a tougher one, okay?
Odoo?
Yeah, Odoo. Well, Odoo is open source, though. So...
Oh, you're just doing open architecture now.
I'm doing open architecture. So the most common, if I wanted to go open architecture ERP, your only real option for closed source open architecture, people are going to kill me for saying this, is Epicor. And I hate to say, but Epicor is open architecture. Because of the new leadership, they pivoted to an open architecture approach where ERP is no longer the center of the universe. It's actually a node in an ecosystem.
Not Zoho? Zoho?
Well, Zoho's more CRM specific as opposed to ERP. But we could make an argument that Zoho is open. You could put Zoho. You wouldn't see that in industry, though. Zoho is really...
It's like CMMS type of...
right.
Yeah.
And then at the cloud layer, we're going to... AWS is way more open architecture than Azure is. Okay, so we're going to go AWS on the cloud layer, and then there are some additional tools. We're going to have HighByte Intelligence Hub is our data operations platform that runs all the way down that stack. Okay, and then you're going to have an MQTT broker. My preference is EMQX, but the other players are HiveMQ, which the architecture I talk about later is going to be using HiveMQ, or Litmus's new broker, or Mosquito's open source, so we're not going to use Mosquito there. That is your open architecture stack, okay? That's the most predominant one. Any other things you want to add?
So what I was going to say with the open architecture, the important thing, I think, isn't just that it can communicate with other things, it can do it easily. Because
Correct.
I can have
natively.
A Rockwell PLC can talk to a pump over Profibus, but it's not fun.
The level of effort, the level of engineering effort. Yep.
And I think anywhere where, I think if something's closed architecture, forget it. If it's not an open architecture, there is no point nowadays even entertaining using it.
Correct. That needs to be your starting point. Open architecture needs to be your starting point.
Yeah.
Right?
And if someone talks about having a tightly coupled ecosystem, run away.
Run away. Yeah.
So then once you've got that, I'm at what's the best tool I can use, regardless of whether it's closed, regardless of whether I have to pay for it, regardless of whether it's open. As I said, I don't care so much about open source because I know I'm not going to do the diligence and look at it, and I know I'm not going to fork, and that's me. That's I did make an improvement to something that's open source on GitHub once.
That's a starting point for most, Mark. I don't antagonize you for it. I think where I would take issue is best for whom, and how do you know what's best because you're only going off what your current level of knowledge is. I think as you begin, and all of us, especially now in the age of open LLMs out there, the more knowledge somebody has, they're going to start thinking like we do. Yes. So they're going to ask, this is not the best. What is the best for me in my environment? And to finish that off, when you have open source projects out there, what you do get is actually diversity in the businesses who provide niche services to meet each of those requirements. And here's the best part. You know exactly how much they should be charging because you can do the research yourself to see how much compute power does it take, how much time does it actually take to stand this up. And you do not get that with closed source.
I got a question then. So then why, if you say, well, I like open source because it gets me, let's just say 80% of the way there, and then the last 20% I can develop myself, why then like would Ignition with its allowing of its SDK and be able to build your own modules not be able to fill that gap for you?
Well, because the obvious reason is the capital investment required. So once you enter in SDK, not everybody gets the SDK from inductive automation. Inductive automation are the gatekeepers. They are the ones who give you permission to use the SDK. You have to be vetted by inductive automation. You have to be vetted.
Oh, okay, I thought anyone could develop modules.
No. You have to have permission. They vet you and they go, we trust that you can build a module. They give you an API key. Then you use that to download the SDK, develop your module, and be able to license your module on the platform. They are the gatekeepers to who can develop modules.
Okay,
so that is fair. The obvious. That's the obvious. Let's go to the FOSS piece here real quick. Let's walk through the stack. Let's say I wanted to go purely open source. So that is, I'm only going to use open source solutions from through the 5-layer stack. Let's start with PLC HMI. Mark, the obvious solution on the edge would be Arduino. Arduino is open source.
That's very limited in power.
Super limited.
I would say you have code assist type solutions. Wago do a lot of
IEC 61131. So IEC 61131 style. Yep.
I don't like. I prefer Open PLC to code assist. Yep. And that's just a preference for me and code assist. But HMI. I've looked at the open SCADA stuff. I tried. Now it's been 5+ years since I've tried it, and I kind of felt like I was back in the 80s. So, if I'm going to develop something it's probably going to be a dashboard in Node-RED.
Node-RED, yeah.
They were laughing at me on a call today because everything I suggested was Node-RED. And I love Node-RED. It is awesome.
Yeah.
But
and we're going to talk about Node-RED more here in a minute. Yeah.
If I'm putting in a HMI if I'm putting in a PLC or HMI, I'm very hard. I'm not going to go with anything open. No, I might put in a PLC next. Nothing that's open source. I'm on the stack we just had, the open architecture. There's nothing on level 1, level 2 that I go, yeah, that's a great product for you. Bar niche cases for the Arduino, I put that in a few places. Absolutely.
So at the SCADA layer, we agree. Open SCADA is our prime.
Well, I got to give.
It's not whether or not it's practical. It's what's available. So
I got to give James Joy a shout out then, because recently he's been working on this project Kraken, and he had developed Anywhere SCADA, which is open source SCADA, and it's built on a broker. I mean, its web page looks like Ignition kind of.
Yeah, it's not ready for prime time, but it is an option. So I was going to. Yeah, it might get there.
Look like it might get there. I haven't dug it up.
That's why I wanted to shout them out to maybe get some community involvement.
So you got Arduino on the edge. Best case scenario, in my opinion, for the HMI layer is going to be Node-RED. Mark and I agree there. Enri, agree there?
Okay. Yeah.
Supervisory control data acquisition, we got Kraken and we have Open SCADA. Although the people who pay the bills are not going to be happy with what you build in Open SCADA. It looks very dated, shall we say.
Or the other option is you bootstrap it completely from the language and you build out those SCADA features.
Yeah, you use React and JavaScript and your SCADA layer, right? You could build it. MES is, really Odoo is basically the only thing, and it doesn't calculate OEE. So, but you would be able to write a module that calculated OEE.
Node-RED will calculate your OEE. I keep coming back to Node-RED everything. Node-RED, the problem will be scale with Node-RED. You'll do it for a line, you might squeeze in for a plant. Once you've got to do it in enterprise, you're going to struggle. And that's a little bit of some of the problems I have.
At the ERP layer, you've got Odoo. Yeah. Odoo is a completely open source ERP solution. And in the cloud layer, I'm just going to basically say anything Apache. So Kafka, enter in, it's going to be anything Apache. Okay. So NiFi, Kafka, and then on the, the data lake side, you're going to use, I don't know, Postgres with timescale or something.
Have
But
you guys used much of the PLC4X Apache environment?
so the answer is I tested and then just kind of abandoned it.
Fair enough.
Okay. All right. So we've established open architecture and open source. Let's talk about how people are actually using the two together. We agree open architecture is the minimum. So I'll have Mark chime in here too, because I know he's probably doing this a lot. But here's a really common application. Right now, we have a HiveMQ broker. We have Kepware, which is commercial software. We have HiByte, which is commercial software. We have Ignition, which is commercial software. We have HiveMQ, which is our broker, which is commercial software. And we have Snowflake, which is our data lake and data warehouse, which is commercial software. We have 5 open architecture commercial pieces of software in our infrastructure. Okay. And if you're in Mastermind, when you look at our unified namespace right now, if you go to the broker, the .25 broker, you will see I have a simulator just running there's an enterprise running in there. Okay. It's just running all day long. Here's how I use open source with that infrastructure. I may want to deploy like data analytics on the edge for my infrastructure. And so what I'm using is Portainer, which is open source. I'm using the edge features. So I turn edge features on in Portainer, and I build a stack out of Ming. So I build my own Ming stack, Mosquito, InfluxDB, Node-RED, and Grafana. InfluxDB is the local historian on the edge. Grafana is going to be for the dashboarding. Node-RED is going to be for all the wiring everything together and all my business logic. And I'm using Mosquito if I just want to store something, a topic or something on the edge. But primarily what I'm doing is I am going to Portainer, I am deploying my stack, and my stack is immediately connects directly to my HiveMQ broker. And I have business logic running in Node-RED that goes ahead and it auto-subscribes to the topics I care about, funnels all that data into Influx, and then I'm able to visualize. Let's say I only want to visualize for 30 minutes. I am spinning up an open source environment on this stack that's allowing me to just store this data over 30 minutes, and then I just take the stack down, and that's how I'm using open source in conjunction with open architecture. Mark, what about you?
So I draw this series, and I've shared with a lot of people, of architectures. And the first one, you have ERP up here, and you have PLCs at the bottom, and you have people running with paper between. And that's where I normally get involved with systems. And that's a lot of people's architecture. And then you've got what we tried with Industry 3 and the point-to-point. And then the landing point that I would often have is using a Ming stack to Mosquitoes in the middle. I'll use Timescale for my store. I'll use Node-RED for the wires and Grafana for visualization. Build up something that will give them a view. And it'll work for a line. It'll work well. And then it moves on to what I call Ignition does everything. Because when I want to get to 10 lines, but it's still a small plant, I'm going to leverage an Ignition. And I think the complaint that Enri might have is that it's almost a victim of its success. I can do my broker, I can do my IT gateway, my OT gateway, I can talk to my ERP, I can have a historical store, and it makes it easy for me, and it gets quick value. And then it goes on to what I think of as the Walker-Reynolds stack, where I start to use Canary and HiByte, and I start to use these more advanced tools as they build up. And I tend to live on the edge. That idea, as I said, stack on Portainer on an edge device, that does something on one machine, bread and butter, and more of it seems to be coming. But it gets to a point where I need something to orchestrate those. It works very well where you have where every machine has the same code inside it and the same structure of motors and the same structure, where you can reuse it. Where everything was developed by a different developer, it becomes a lot harder. And when we talk about open and sharing and this, I think, as an industry, there's more value to be gained by people sharing. Here's a really cool block I have for a motor. Here you can put this block in Ignition, this block in Siemens, this block in Allen Bradley, and they're going to talk really quickly together, and they're going to put this into, because you've developed, every integrator who's on that Discord channel has developed their own motor block. And
Yep, no doubt about it.
And the amount of hours and the amount of things that are there, if we could open source some of the solutions we're making.
Yep. I mean, by the way, that was supposed to be SESME, here in the United States. One of SESME's missions was to open source profiles. And how has that worked out?
Yeah.
I mean, who here is using SESME profiles for a bioreactor?
Yeah.
Nobody. Nobody's
smart
using
manufacturing profiles.
Right. Yeah, right. Nobody's using. I agree with you, Mark. I mean, at the end of the day, the real issue in our industry, the reason I've always been big open architecture, I've driven the minimum technical requirements for software, was because I wanted seamless interplay between solutions in an ecosystem, whether it's commercial or open source. And the open architecture piece was you must be open architecture. If I cannot access the things I build inside your solution externally from a non-partner of yours, then I can't use your software. Okay? I mean, it's just that simple.
Yeah.
But the reason I've always advocated for that is because to try and get everyone to agree on what a data model is for a motor, or what a data model is for a bioreactor or for a pump. I mean, think about it. A motor is a motor is a motor, yet I have seen at least 100 different versions of a motor information model.
Yeah.
Right?
All I hear is 4 completely different people sharing the exact same need. And none of our needs actually having been met. That's all I hear, which is enough for me to say clearly there is plenty of room for some sort of advocacy, serious advocacy to.
Well, where is open source today? Let's answer that question for the audience. Is open source, our FOSS solutions, is the Ming stack ready to be the infrastructure? And I mean not a part of, but is it ready for prime time? Could you build a scalable enterprise infrastructure with just open source solutions today and be able to compete?
I think we would need that $3 billion.
I think so too.
Yeah, I would say.
I actually like the Walker Reynolds stack. We should bet.
Yeah, I would say, Mark, you agree? It's not quite ready.
But I mean, let's put. I mean, if I bid a job and you bid a job, and I'm using the Ming stack and you're using Ignition, even with the licenses, you will come in cheaper with a better solution because you'll deliver faster.
Correct. So, but where is FOSS going? Because I actually think most people will be surprised with the conclusion here. The more and more I use the open source solutions, the problems that I used to run into with open source are becoming fewer and fewer. Here's an example. Okay, so
what does Ming stack stand for again? It's Mosquito.
Mosquito, InfluxDB, Grafana, and Node-RED.
Node-RED, yeah.
Okay, so Node-RED's the third one. Okay, so here's a really good example. Node-RED is an open source piece of software where the developers of Node-RED are completely different than the people who develop InfluxDB. Influx is very similar to Portainer. It's open source with commercial offering, okay? And the development is funded by the commercial sales. All right. And Node-RED isn't that way. There are solutions on top of Node-RED, like FlowFuse, right? It's FlowFuse, not FlowForge anymore. Yep. FlowFuse is a commercial offering to manage many Node-RED deployments, okay? In the old days, if you were to look at the nodes which are all written in JavaScript inside Node.js, written in JavaScript in Node-RED, if you were to look at the nodes, which are all developed by different people, if you go to npm and look up a node for, say, OPC, you're going to see like 8 different nodes that you could put into Node-RED that all ostensibly talk OPC UA, DA, HDA, whatever. One of the things that was really common was that those nodes you would have to be very careful about the versions of the software you were using, okay? Because the node would lag behind new releases of software. You would need to wait before. It's just like on my Mac. I don't update my Mac OS until I'm sure that the Canon EOS webcam utility has a version for the new version of the Mac OS. So I wait to update. You would run into that issue with Node-RED all the time, okay? Especially with Influx. If you look with InfluxDB and you use the Influx connector in Node-RED, there are 3 different versions of connectivity. There's 1, there's 1.8, and there's version 2. And depending upon which version of Node-RED of Influx you're using, you have to use a different type of connect. You have to use a different setting in the node. In open source software, that you would run into incompatibility issues because you were using software that's too new very often.
Yeah,
that would be a problem. I'm seeing that less and less now.
that's very true. Can I roll back a second? Wait, and I think it's important to shout this out, just because when you said, "Can we develop a full stack?" We're very close. I think United Manufacturing Hub are very close to what they do. They're doing it. I haven't seen behind the hood. I haven't seen there. I'm not going to Hanover. It's the 1 week of the year I cannot travel, and I was really looking forward to meeting them and you. But so it is very close. If anybody's interested in how to make a Ming stack at a enterprise level, that's the place to go. And fabulous.
The UMH is going to be the thing that you bolt onto the Ming stack to make it enterprise scalable.
But yeah, I mean, they're the one, and it's just there. So it's to say it's really ubiquitous and very easy, and it's easy to do. That's not quite true either.
UMH topic, I think really what projects like UMH truly need, aside from the obvious of capital funding, I frankly truly believe are really, really staunch journalists behind the scenes to keep showing why projects like UMH have not been able to kick off as large as UMH is trying to do today. And inevitably, they can't do it all. And this is where I think we have sort of independent journalists in the consumer grade electronic space with role models like Louis Rossmann, and we need this in the industrial space. I am happy to miserably fail at it as the first go, and people can use that as a role model of what not to do. But I'll be damned if I don't take this approach, because
I don't think you fail. I don't think you failed at it.
Enri, what's driving you?
To be honest with you, I think it's been a lifetime of bearing personal witness to a lot of these behaviors and being fed up with being fed up. I am tired of seeing this daily. I'm tired of seeing friends and colleagues lose jobs despite constant increased profitability. I am tired of having to be the sole go-to support system for people who we overall have failed. And I'm tired of having the same conversation of it doesn't have to be this way. And somebody at some point is going to have to take the reins. And
that's why you took the stab at Inductive, was because you kind of see them as not is kind of a barrier to that success almost.
Inductive is simply a symbol. I do not see them anything more than just that. They are nothing more than a symbol of exactly what is the rest of the field. In my eyes, although there is a caveat Inductive can hide behind and say open architecture, I do not see them, frankly, as any more different. I think there are positive niche aspects they can do, but they are truly in the same sauce, so to speak, and it does not come to anybody's benefit. The adage I go by is accept what people take and acknowledge for at their word, but always have the ability to verify it thereafter. And that's fundamentally what open source allows you to do forever, regardless of the point in time you are. And you do not get that option with closed source, period. You will never have that.
So Josh, right now, what's happening is when you go to the recording, it's all just okay. By the way, that's okay. First off, this should never happen. Okay, so okay, good. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'll clap my hands so Jared can see my hands clap, and I'll take it home, and I'll just say, hey, listen, Enri had to drop. So you're not even getting his video?
There's not a cloud version that's recording the backup? Oh, that'll work perfectly.
All right, perfect. Do that. Awesome. So, all right. So, but my point is, you're recording with OBS, right, Enri? All right. So if he's recording with OBS, then he can share the file, and Jared can splice everything together.
Although that might have been what caused the issue.
All right. So then, in that case, we can just keep acting as. So let's talk about where is open source going. Kind of our conclusion. And if you are curious about open source, how should you be using it right now? Like my position, as it stands right now, I do not believe open source is ready for the big time. I would never encourage any of our architects here to build a solely open source infrastructure for a client and expect it to scale to an enterprise level. However, that being said, I believe we're getting really close. And there's two pieces here. Number one, LLMs are much bigger game changers than you think they are. The vast majority of people just don't understand what the implications are on our economy. So many people only half of us are going to work in the economy of the future. Literally 50% of people who today will have jobs are not going to have the jobs in the future. They are going to do other things. They're going to support our society in other ways, through the arts, through entertainment, but also through open source software development. Okay? And so I think we are going to see a big influx of people who have the ability to support open source solutions, and they'll have tools like ChatGPT to help them with their development. For example, I encourage you to do this. Go on some open source project. Go to MQTT Explorer. Extract just one of the files and load that file into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to explain to you how this code works and to list all the functions, what the inputs and the outputs are. And in 30 seconds, you can do what it is that used to take you 8 to 12 hours just looking at one software file that you had never looked at before, one piece of source code. You relied on the human comment, which was always missing. Okay, so the reality is I actually agree with Enri here that we are going to see an explosion in the development of open source. Is going to stay much closer to commercial software in feature sets, debugging, et cetera, in the software development lifecycle. I believe that that's a huge piece. What should you be doing today? I think you should be using a combination of open architecture, infrastructure with open source. That's what I think you should be doing. I mean, we use lots of open source. I mean, we use Kafka all the time as our data streaming processor to our data lake from the unified namespace. We use Kafka all the time. We use Apache NiFi all the time. I'm using Node-RED all the time. I'm using Portainer every single day. There's lots of open source solutions that I'm using. And I think it's only going to become more and more. Enri and Mark. And for those of you, I apologize for the change in the editing here because Enri ran out of disk space, so we had to get the audio from a different place. But go ahead, Mark. Mark and Enri, your guys' take.
What I was going to say is, and I've been recently asked for some reason, I don't know why, for people my advice on how they become an IoT engineer, an Industry 4.0 engineer. And I've said repeatedly, you figure out how to get the Mink stack onto Portainer, have your container, make a PLC or a program, a Python script that pretends to be a PLC with Modbus, and have a value that you can extract through Node-RED, normalize it, store it. I use timescale, not influx, but that doesn't matter, and have it on a graph. And I didn't know how to do that till I started typing all of those into ChatGPT, and it wrote the Python script for me, and I went, this is how I do it. And if you can do that I'm convinced you've done more IoT integration than 97% of the people who talk about IoT.
Agreed.
And
Enri?
if you can show one number graphing, you can show a million. So every IoT engineer should know how to use the Ming stack and whatever other free open source software comes along on top of it. But there are places, and I've done a lot of PLC safety. I used to be a system. That's one place where, I'm not gonna go there for a long time. I want my TUV certified safety.
And
device.
by the way, Arduino, just for I had a meeting with Arduino yesterday. Arduino does not advocate using their PLCs for critical applications. They do not advocate in fact, they argue you should be using our PLCs for like data acquisition and data processing. Okay. They even Arduino openly admits, they themselves will say, this is not for mission critical. Like if you're using the Opta Wi-Fi, don't use the Opta Wi-Fi for a mission critical application. Do you want to use the H7 Portenta H7? Sure. But not the other Arduino open source solutions like the Opta Wi-Fi, for example. Enri, parting thoughts from you.
Not only will open source be equal to commercial feature sets, I say they will absolutely overcome it. And it is only logically the sound conclusion to make, as you have far more eyes, you have far more people, and the results ultimately speak for themselves. The fact that commercial tools rely on fundamental open source technologies to drive them is a joke and a meme in and of itself.
Well, think about it this way. Here's a really good way. I agree with you. Think about it this way. What percentage of the population 10 years ago could write code? You know, what is it? 0.0001% of all the people on Earth. Today, I could train someone to write code in a week.
I mean,
with the tools.
One of the things I had actually for a while, just because I was super frustrated, is I went ahead and see if I could build a tool-up alternative. I made a whole canvas, put some widgets on it, and then really came close to telling Tulip, "Hey, I built your platform."
It's at the end of the day. I hate to break. Is writing software hard when you have to go look up all the documentation yourself and spend 6 or 8 hours a day on Stack Overflow? Yeah, absolutely. It's hard. Is it hard today? No, it is not hard today. You could train yourself to be a developer today in 7 days if you just knew which tools to start with.
But if I ask a question, when did Linux take a huge jump in market share and really gain that credibility as an option? Because my memory, and I could be wrong, is Microsoft brought out a really bad, unstable server version. They had an OS, they had a couple that were bad, and the open source solution was better.
Yeah,
2016.
No, it was way before that. It was
2000.
It was 2000.
08.
I mean, Red Hat became like de facto. I mean, mid 2000s, 2005, 2006. I started seeing it everywhere.
Server 2000 was really good, but 2008 wasn't as much.
Yeah.
I got Red Hat in about 2002. I remember, so it was starting to.
But the IT departments at large enterprises wouldn't get on board.
But today, imagine you're going to spin up a VM in the cloud, and what you're going to do is you're going to run code on that VM. That's the only thing you're going to do. You're going to call scripts and stuff. You would never, in a million years, make that a Windows server. Even if Windows gave it away for free. Yeah. Let's say there was no licensing. You would never use Windows for that, where you need you want that server to run for months and months and months without anybody looking at it, and that script just runs every 15 minutes or whatever it is. You're running that on Linux because it's bulletproof.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And you think about it, all the people that Microsoft have on hand. Anyway, all right, guys. Hey, listen, so Mark O'Donovan, Enri, Marini, Zach, thank you guys for. We were actually shooting this on a Friday afternoon. It's late in Ireland for Mark. We never shoot these on Fridays. This was like the only day we could make it work. I really appreciate you guys coming on. For those of you who have questions about FOSS and Ming, honestly, the best place to go is go to iiot.university/Discord and join our Discord server and ask your questions in there. There are literally thousands of people in there who are currently using these stacks in industrial applications. You just ask the question, hey, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and you are going to get 20 or 30 different people answering how they do that exact same thing you just asked. Okay? All right. Guys, thanks for joining me. Like, subscribe, comment down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.